Hello, I'm Jason Walls here from interest.co.nz, and I'm sitting with Treasury Secretary Gabriel Makhlouf, and we're talking future of the New Zealand economy, some of the big risks that we're facing, and some of the ways that we might be able to adapt to some of the changes. So I'd like to start off by talking about a report that the Treasury released back in 2016 that said that over the next 40 years, by 2060, New Zealand's debt level for the government is going to get up to roughly about 200% of GDP. And so that's jumping from about 21% now. So the government has this real focus on reducing net debt, but I want to talk to you a little bit about that 200% number. Why are you predicting that we're going to get that high?
Well, those are projections, and they're just assuming that government policies essentially don't change, and they assume, again, that the growth in spending just continues over a horizon. So in practical terms, we don't expect that to actually happen, because the Public Finance Act requires governments to run surpluses and requires governments to basically run a responsible fiscal policy. So governments will take action to make sure that doesn't happen. But so what the report does is give a sense of what would happen if no action was taken. And it also gives a sense of what options and choices ministers have. Our 2013 report, we're required to produce this every 4 years. Our 2013 report was actually quite explicit about the different choices. We gave different scenarios. So I think it will be managed. I'm confident it will be managed.
Right, so the report was essentially conveying this is what will happen if nothing changes?
Yeah.
Yes. And so what are some of the things that they're looking at now that would look at getting that debt level quite high if nothing does change?
Well, the government in the short term is actually, as the finance minister said last week, the government is running a policy that's going to reduce in the short term net debt to below 20% of GDP, and at the same time it's actually going to be spending more money over the next few years, and that's a reflection that the economy is growing. So one of the ways to manage net debt is to make sure the economy grows, and from the Treasury perspective, we like to focus both on how we grow the economy, but also how we manage our spending sensibly. And growing the economy, increasingly, we're just not talking about simple growth or an increase in gross domestic product. We're talking about growing our natural capital, our social capital, our human capital, as well as our physical and financial capital. So if you grow the economy and manage your spending sensibly, you can manage your debt levels. So
the idea is that over the various cycles between now and 2060, that as long as growth keeps ticking up at a reasonable level, we should be okay?
Yeah, we should be okay, as long as we just we do manage our spending. And one of the things that the Treasury has highlighted over the last two or not three reports about the long term is there are two particular pressures that we need to manage. One is the fact that the population is aging, and the other one is the increase in health costs, partly as a result of longevity, as well as the improvements in health technology. And the things that we have recommended in the past is actually, just as an example, is the age of superannuation probably should increase. It was set at a time when longevity, since it was set, longevity has changed. I mean, people increasingly are working past 65, and we think it's one of the changes that government could make, and it could make it, it doesn't have to change it tomorrow, it could change it in 30, 40 years' time, and that would be a good thing. It would help the government to it will give the government more choices. So that's an example of making sure, from our perspective, that you manage your spending in a way but allows you to have as much flexibility around the choices you have in the future.
Now, looking at New Zealand's aging population, where we're seeing, similar to like Japan, where we're going to get to a few years' time and we're going to have a lot of our now working age population going into superannuation. Is raising the retirement age to 67 high enough? Does it need to go potentially beyond that to help mitigate this issue?
I think ultimately it's all about choices. So, you could raise it much higher and it'll give you more choices to spend money elsewhere. Or you could leave it at 65 and actually make your choices, somewhere else. So the Treasury itself doesn't have a particular view on where the age should end up. I mean, all we've been saying is, in terms of managing the long term, this is an area where the parameters that you set, that were set when the legislation was first put in place, have really changed, and you should think about what it means for the choices you have around spending.
So is it an argument of offsetting, essentially? So if we don't put the retirement age up, or we don't put more money into super, we're going to have to do something in other areas just so we can manage this risk?
Well, it also depends on what happens to the economy and how it grows, and it also it depends on a whole bunch of things. But at the end of the day, one of the things that we know will be true in 100 years' time and probably in 500 years' time is there won't be enough money to meet all the needs that everybody wants all of the time. So governments always have to make choices, and it is, as governments right now have decided, they actually do want to pay a pension when people reach 65, and they want to do it in a particular way, and that's a choice that's been made, and in the future, people may decide actually that remains the priority. From a Treasury perspective, there's no right or wrong. The main thing that we're doing is saying, if you want to run responsible and fiscal policy, you're going to have to make choices, and these are areas that we could see emerging as pressures.
But in terms of the next few years or the next 40 years, I mean, New Zealand's economic cycle might go through a downturn. We've got things like natural disasters that could be a problem as well. Isn't there more that needs to be done rather than just relying on growth and the age of superannuation to help kind of curb this issue now before it gets worse in the future?
Well, I mean, we've got to manage, and the government is doing this. We've got to make sure we have buffers to cope with shocks. You talked about natural disasters, and we've had the experience in the last 10 years of coping with both a natural disaster and a global financial disaster, and having a buffer to do that is something which this government and the previous government were focused on. So I think we have to continue to manage the short term. We have time to manage the long term. We don't need to make quick decisions today to manage where we may be in 40 years' time. The important thing is to be clear that you've got to make some decisions over the long term. The last government decided actually to change the age of superannuation, and it gave a 40-year time horizon. It was proposing a 40-year time horizon for that. So we think, that is entirely reasonable position to take. So I wouldn't be recommending to ministers that they need to make action immediately to fix the long term. They just need to be aware of it. And we know that this government's got a particular policy just to pick an example of the economic side of the house. It wants to reduce our emissions by 2050. And that has significant implications for the economy and how it works. It wants a just transition, and there's a lot of work going on right now to work out what that will be. As government makes the choices around that, it'll have its eye on what the fiscal implications and the macroeconomic implications are of some of that significant structural change that it wants to see in the economy.
But when we get to 2060, we're going to have a lot more of the money that we spend now is going to go into health. A lot more of it's going to go into super. Yes, we will have a growing economy as well, but if we don't want to get debt levels up high, we're going to have to change other things in other areas just so we don't have to keep spending heaps more or borrowing a little bit more. What really you say that things don't need to be done like snap like really quickly now, but surely things have to be changing at least at the margins a little bit more now to prepare in the future, or is that already being done enough in your perspective?
Well, from the Treasury's perspective, we think there are some things that we would recommend doing. So we would recommend, as I said earlier, we would recommend that we change the age of superannuation in the long term to give people to prepare for that change. I mean, I think that's probably, from our perspective, that is a change worth taking. But the government's decided it's not going to do that, which is, you know, entirely appropriate decision for it to take. I mean, my own view at the moment is that the government is running a responsible fiscal policy, as was set out in the Treasury's economic and fiscal update. The government's own fiscal strategy report, which it published last week, sets out a responsible fiscal direction in line with the Public Finance Act for the 10 years after the Treasury's own forecast period. I think during this time we need to be just pretty aware of what the long-term picture is telling us, and you know, the Treasury will be publishing another long-term fiscal picture by 2020. And governments will have choices. I mean, I can't really go beyond just saying we don't need to make immediate decisions today. There are some decisions that we can take which will help in the long term, but government has choices as to when they want to do that.
Right. So you've got a new long-term sustainability report coming out in 2019, is it? They're every 3 years?
No, they have to be done at least every 4 years.
At least every
so we haven't decided. We published the last one in November 2016. So we have to publish the next one by November 2020. We haven't decided exactly when it will come out.
So what do you think would change between the 2016 one and the one that you're working on now?
If there's two things, and probably in this order. Firstly, since 2016, we've got a different government, which has got a different set of policies. And clearly those policies will have to make projections. I mean, our previous projections were based on the previous government's policies. So, you know, we'll be projecting something based on a different set of policies. And secondly, the global environment is changing. I don't expect in the 4-year window that we're talking about that there will be that significant change that will impact the 60-year horizon, 40-plus year horizon, but it could happen.
And just looking at other countries in the world, we mentioned Japan earlier before. Do you take much notice of what they're doing because they have a similar problem or issue that they're going to be facing in a few years' time with their aging population? Do you look for what they're doing as a case study for how we can do it?
Oh, we certainly look at an international picture. You know, I mean, partly just directly to what you just said, to see how they're managing the pressures around superannuation, because all countries have got similar challenges, and most countries, many countries around the world in the last 10 years have increased their age. That's their response. They've taken decisions to increase the age of superannuation. In some countries, over a relatively short time scale, but you know, for many of them, they've given more than 20 years sort of notice from memory. So we look to see, you know, how other countries are doing. We look to see what the developments in some of these expensive spending areas, and what we can learn from those. I mentioned health earlier. We know that health spending will be going up as a proportion of GDP, partly because of aging, but also because of just developments in technology are becoming more expensive. So we learn from just observing what's happening elsewhere. At the end of the day, international comparisons only take us so far, because what's really important is the policy solutions for New Zealand are actually appropriate to New Zealand, and governments make choices about what they want to do for the people they represent, as opposed to what other countries do.
Just finally, there was some comments this week by Phil Twyford, essentially calling out some Treasury officials, and he used the word kids and some other things that he later said that he regret. He said, from your perspective, how does it make, or what's the reaction of the Treasury been to these sort of comments?
Well, I think we were disappointed. I personally signed the economic and fiscal update. It's been a while since someone called me a kid, so I don't know whether to take it as a compliment. But at the end of the day, we do a professional job, and the people who turn up here every day to work for the Treasury are looking to improve the living standards of New Zealanders. So we're professionals, we're committed to what we do.
And the criticisms he was making of the actual figures themselves, what do you make of that? Because the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance have came out and backed MBIE's numbers.
I'm very confident in the professional judgment we exercised and in the numbers that we published.
Does it get quite frustrating for you, because this isn't the first time a minister's come out and called out the Treasury for its numbers? Does it get frustrating for you to consistently hearing this? I mean, we know that John Key did it before, and Jerry Brownlee's done it a few times.
At the end of the day, we stand by the information we publish. We are required to, by law, to use our best professional judgment. If people want to take a different view, they're entitled to take a different view. I observe that we are the best, if not one of the best forecasters of the New Zealand economy. We've got a very good track record. It would be fantastic if people always celebrated the Treasury's products, but sometimes people, for a variety of reasons, are unhappy with them, and we're just professionals.
And have you got a message to Phil Twyford?
I think he's apologised. I understand he's apologised for some of the language he used, so I think that's a good thing.
Cool. We'll leave it there. Well, thank you very much for the chat, and thank you very much for watching.